Welcome back to BioB 160 Principles of Living Systems. I'm Ruth Reitzman, your instructor for the course, and in this episode we'll continue our exploration of the tree of life and look at some of the protists and fungi. Let's get started. In this episode we'll look at some examples of organisms in the domain Eukarya, including the protists, a very diverse group of organisms that are circled in red, and we'll look at the fungi, a group of organisms that are nature's recyclers and are circled in yellow in this tree. The protists are a very diverse group of organisms within the kingdom Eukarya. They are largely grouped in one giant catch-all category because they're single-celled organisms. They're found in aquatic environments, either freshwater or saltwater, and they have varied nutritional patterns, either autotrophic, meaning they are photosynthetic, or they're heterotrophic, meaning they can use organic carbon. And some are capable of both autotrophic and heterotrophic metabolism and are called mixotrophic organisms. These single-celled organisms fill a variety of roles in our world. Some protists are responsible for serious human diseases, such as malaria or giardiasis. Others are essential components of the food chain, such as plankton, that serve as food for invertebrates or other organisms. And still others are responsible for oxygen production, such as the algae. This diagram shows the relationship between protists found in an aquatic environment in the ocean and the larger organisms such as fish, birds, and mammals. The primary producers are capable of photosynthesis and fix the carbon in an organic form. These organisms are consumed by other protists, which are then consumed by larger animals. Each organism depends upon the other, and without the protist there's a huge gap in the food chain. So what are the evolutionary origins of the protists? This diagram shows the origins of eukaryotes via endosymbiosis, or literally the engulfment of one organism by another. At some point in cellular evolution, the first prokaryotic organisms developed a symbiotic relationship. For example, the engulfment of a photosynthetic cyanobacterium by a heterotrophic organism gave rise to the first eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms. In some cases, these organisms retained their photosynthetic symbiont, which is the origins of the chloroplast. In other cases, the early photosynthetic organisms were engulfed by other heterotrophs to give rise to the diversity of protists that we see today. Now let's look at a few examples of protists. The flagellated protist Euglena is an example of an organism that is both photosynthetic and heterotrophic. Euglena has chloroplasts, making it a photosynthetic autotroph, and it can use organic carbon for energy, making it a heterotroph. Another familiar protist is the amoeba. Amoeba move by extensions of their cytoplasm called pseudopods, or false feet. Amoeba are heterotrophic organisms and ingest food by surrounding particles with their pseudopods, bringing them inside the cell body for digestion by phagocytosis. You may have also seen the paramecium, a ciliated protozoan that zips around its aqueous environment with oar-like cilia. The paramecium is a heterotroph that feeds by sweeping particles into its oral groove with its cilia. Another example in the protists are the diatoms. Diatoms are jewel-like protists with cell walls made of silica. Their cell walls are glass-like and they're very resistant to mechanical damage because of their strong cell walls. The rigid cell wall of the diatoms makes them very useful for applications such as polishing agents, filters, and more recently nanotechnology. The diatoms are photosynthetic and are some of the important primary producers in aquatic habitats. The dinoflagellates are another group of protists with an interesting structure. The dinoflagellates have two flagella that wind around their bodies and allow the cells to swim. Dinoflagellates have cell walls made of cellulose and have varied forms of energy production. Some are photosynthetic or autotrophic, while others are heterotrophic. Some dinoflagellates are responsible for blooms called red tides. Red tides can consume oxygen and are responsible for fish kills. Now we'll turn our attention to a few of the protists that are responsible for human and animal diseases. The trypanosomes are flagellated protozoans that live in the blood and are transmitted through the bite of insects. Two of the trypanosomes are responsible for human infections, the African trypanosome, which causes sleeping sickness, and the American trypanosome, which causes Chagas disease. Both of these parasites are responsible for thousands of infections each year in endemic areas, but can be prevented by avoiding contact with their insect vectors. A little closer to home, we can find the intestinal parasite Giardia in our own backyard. Giardia is carried in the intestines of many mammals, including raccoons, beavers, and cows. If you're out backpacking, it's a good idea to pack a water filtration system or some water purification tablets. Giardia can cause a very distressing form of diarrhea and would certainly end your fun in the back country. So be aware of Giardia and the risks that you take when you take a drink from a clear mountain stream without passing it through a water filter. The most important parasite for human health is Plasmodium, which causes malaria. The disease malaria causes more deaths worldwide than any other single cause. The bloodborne parasite is found in nearly all tropical areas of the world and is transmitted by mosquitoes. The symptoms of malaria include fevers, chills, and the disease often kills by affecting organs such as the kidney, livers, and brain. There are no vaccines available for malaria prevention. However, the disease is treated with quinine derivatives or artemisinin. Now let's take a look at the malaria life cycle and see how it affects the human host. The malaria parasite is transmitted to humans through the bite of mosquitoes. The saliva of the mosquito transmits the infective sporozoite stage, which invades the liver and transforms into the merozoite stage. The merozoites replicate in the liver and then invade red blood cells. This cycle of cell invasion and release continues for several weeks and produces the fevers and chills seen in malaria infection. After a few rounds of replication, some of the merozoites transform into gametocytes. The gametocyte is the infective stage for the mosquito. If a mosquito takes a blood meal from an infected human and picks up gametocytes, the mosquito is now infected. Within the gut of the mosquito, the gametes form zygotes. The zygotes form an oocyst, which then produce sporozoites. The sporozoites invade the salivary glands of the mosquito and are then transmitted to the next host as the mosquito bites. By looking at this complex life cycle, you can imagine how difficult it's been to try to develop a vaccine strategy to prevent malaria. Any effective malaria vaccine will need to prevent the sporozoite from invading the liver, but also be able to prevent the disease from progressing through the other life cycle stages. Although this is a difficult problem, it is one that is being addressed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and their funding of malaria prevention research. Before we leave the protists, we'll take a brief look at the algae, a group of photosynthetic protists that produce oxygen for our planet and also play a role in the food chain and in our food production. Algae have various colors of photosynthetic pigments and are classified based on their photosynthetic pigments. Some are green, others are red, and still others are brown. We'll look at a few examples of the algae: the green algae ulva or sea lettuce, the red algae porphyra, which is used in making sushi, or gelidium, which is used to make agar. And the brown algae are familiar to many beach visitors. The brown algae form large multicellular algae that are often called seaweeds. This photo is the green algae, ulva or sea lettuce. This is one of the red algae. If you've ever eaten sushi, you've eaten the green wrapping around the sushi rolls, which is made of layers of red algae. The brown algae is familiar to beachgoers, and the large kelp forests off the Pacific coast provide a habitat for many fish and other marine organisms. This has been a brief tour of the protists, and you should now have some understanding of this diverse group. You should be able to name the examples of the protists discussed in the lecture here, and you should be able to describe the process of endosymbiosis and relate it to the origins of the protists. You should also be able to describe the life cycle of malaria and relate it to how it impacts human health. To continue our tour of the eukaryotes, we'll turn our attention to the fungi. If you've ever found mold growing on your bread or on an orange, you've witnessed the ability of the fungi to decompose materials. In fact, we can think of them as nature's recyclers. Fungi are single-celled or multicellular eukaryotes and are in a kingdom within the domain Eukarya. The study of fungi is called mycology, and fungi are very adept at producing enzymes to absorb foods. Their role in nature is to decompose materials, which is why you find them growing on old bread or fruits. Their job is to simply break down the materials and recycle them, even if it's sooner than we'd like to have them do it. If you take apart a mushroom, you'll find that it's composed of multiple filaments. These individual filaments are called hyphae, and together they form a mass of hyphae called a mycelium. All fungi reproduce by forming spores, and the spores can be small and light structures that are carried on wind currents to areas where there are nutrients for the spores to germinate and grow into mature fungi. This diagram shows a few examples of the fungi. The yeast Saccharomyces is used in bread baking and wine and beer making. The mold Penicillium is the source of the antibiotic penicillin, and the Morchella mushroom is an example of an edible mushroom. Fungi play many interesting and useful roles in nature and in industry. As previously mentioned, the fungi serve a vital role in recycling elements and decomposing materials. Fungi also form useful symbiotic relationships with plants to form mycorrhizae and with algae to form lichens. There are also many products formed by fungi, edible fungi such as mushrooms, and the fermentation products of fungi such as beer, wine, bread, and cheese. And fungi are the source of many of our antibiotics. There are also some bad guys in the fungi category. Some plants are harmed by fungi and they cause damage to crops and ornamental plants. And a few fungi are responsible for human disease, such as the yeast infections that occur in humans or skin infections called ringworm. This slide shows one of the symbiotic forms of fungi, the mycorrhizae fungi that colonize the roots of plants and enable plants to absorb soil nutrients. This photo illustrates the impact of mycorrhizae on plant growth. The seedlings on the left have been grown without mycorrhizae, while the ones on the right have been grown with the mycorrhizae. Notice the larger and healthier growth of the plants on the right that are grown with the mycorrhizae. Another type of symbiotic relationship is shown here. A fungus plus an algae grows together to form a lichen. The two partners that make up the lichen benefit each other. The fungus gains the sugars produced by its photosynthetic partner, while the algae gains protection provided by the fungus. A very beneficial relationship for both organisms. This diagram shows the close relationship of the fungal hyphae in a lichen with its algal partner. Fungi are the source of antibiotics, and the photo here shows the relationship between the penicillium mold, which produces penicillin. The penicillin inhibits the growth of the bacteria, demonstrating the process of antibiosis. Fungi are also pathogens of plants and are responsible for smuts and rusts, diseases of crops and ornamental plants. In our brief tour of the fungi, you should be able to list the characteristics that distinguish the fungi from the other eukarya. You should also be able to describe some of the roles of fungi in our ecosystem, in lichens, animal-fungi relationships, in food production, in medicine, and as pathogens. This concludes this episode of BioB 160 Principles of Living Systems. Be sure to read the chapters and review the questions on the MyLabs homework. Thanks and have a great day.